Hope that you are having a great day. In this lecture, I want to change the discussion quite a bit. In the last discussion or lecture, I talked about the notion of seditious speech. In fact, in the previous two presentations, I talked about it. Um, in this lecture, I'm going to change the conversation quite a bit to this concept called symbolic speech. Now, when I was born in the late 1950s, symbolic speech did not exist as a legal concept. So this is very different than seditious speech. Seditious speech has been around since the beginning of our nation's history. After all, that's what a lot of people did before the Revolution, right? People like Thomas Paine writing Common Sense. Uh, they were inciting potential violence against the government. Now, with symbolic speech, this concept is nonverbal speech. So when we get into the arena of symbolic speech, the real question is, when we're talking about the notion of speech, is speech merely the spoken word? Or instead, is speech a much broader concept, something that we would call freedom of expression? And so since the late 1960s, the court has recognized this concept now for the last half century. And I'm going to talk about four cases. I don't know if I will get to all four of them in this lecture, but I certainly will get as far as I can, and then we'll finish it up in the next mini lecture. But the case that we get this concept from is quite significant. Tinker versus Des Moines. Once again, as I've told you before and will tell you several more times before we're done with this course, often the best Supreme Court cases are ones where the facts are fairly trivial. Think back to Marbury versus Madison, right? The issue in that case was William Marbury entitled to his job as Justice of the Peace for the District of Columbia, right? The facts, whether this man gets a minor judgeship, not significant. But the notion as to whether or not it is the U.S. Supreme Court that determines the constitutionality of law is as important as it gets. So in Tinker versus Des Moines, we have Mary Tinker and her brother John, along with a few other students who decide to engage in political protest. They decide to protest the war in Vietnam by wearing a black armband. Now, I don't have this in the notes, but at the time, a black armband was a well-known symbol of opposition to the war in Vietnam. And to make a very long story short, Mary, as well as her brother, were suspended from school for wearing these armbands. And so the question in this particular case, there are a couple. One is, of course, how much authority does the government, in this case the principals, have in censoring speech? The argument on this side essentially was children come to school not to teach but to learn, and therefore they have fewer speech rights than adults, and that the governing authority or principal has wide discretionary authority. On the other hand, the argument made on behalf of Mary Tinker and her brother John was that freedom of speech does not end at the schoolhouse door, and that students have the right to express their political views. And in this case, the argument was that this was a coherent message. The message here was not primarily to be disruptive. It was to send a very powerful message that we believe the war in Vietnam is immoral, and that it's wrong, and that we are expressing our political views about a war that is very controversial. What I want you to know about this particular case, and the reason that it is so significant, is that this is the Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court broadened or expanded the definition of speech to more than the spoken word. That in this case, the black armband is a well-known symbol of opposition to the war, that an average or normal person in the community would understand the very powerful anti-war message being conveyed, and therefore it was speech. Yes, yes, it is not conventional speech, but at the heart of freedom of speech is the conveyance of an idea that is understood by an average or normal person in the community. And I'm going to use this term a lot because the Supreme Court never tells us exactly who this average or normal person in the community happens to be. I'm not sure if it's me, or if it's one of my kids, or if it's one of you, or it might be all of you. But the Supreme Court will often refer to this notion of an average or normal person often in the community. So the significance of this first case is that freedom of speech is more than the spoken word, and that it is protected by the First Amendment. In the second case, we have another Vietnam War protester. And this protester is a lot more exotic. He's a lot more flamboyant. He uses language that some would find objectionable. You can look at your notes, right? Cohen is wearing this Levi's jacket. He has the letters in big letters on the back of the Levi's jacket, fuck the draft. Underneath it, there are smaller letters saying, oppose the SE Asian War. So Mr. Cohen is not Shakespeare, but certainly an average or normal person would understand this man is opposed to the war in Vietnam. He goes parading up and down the corridors of the Los Angeles County Courthouse, where he's arrested very, very quickly. I've read a few different accounts of this. They say 5 to 10 minutes, and was sentenced to 30 days in county jail for disturbing the peace. Now, what I find most interesting in this particular case is in one account that I read, the arresting officers say that in this particular case, and this really illustrates the sexism of the time. Remember, this case occurs in 1971. The arresting officers say that if only men had been present in the corridors, they would have given him a warning. They would have sent him on his way, that men can handle this rough, coarse, vulgar word. But because women were present in the corridors, they arrested him. In essence, the officers didn't use this word, but my interpretation of this is that the officers wanted to protect these women from being visually assaulted by this word. So Mr. Cohen goes to county jail for 30 days. This case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, once again, keep in mind, the facts in this case aren't very compelling. This man wears a vulgar anti-war jacket to a county courthouse. He's arrested for disturbing the peace, and yet this case goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what's interesting in this case is that the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction. Justice Harlan, in his famous opinion, wrote, quote, one man's vulgarity is another's lyric, right? He said that, because government officials cannot make principal distinctions in this area, the Constitution leaves matters of taste and style largely to the individual. So Justice Harlan is acknowledging, okay, you certainly could say that this man's jacket is vulgar, but it is the conveyance of an idea. It's the conveyance of a coherent idea, and that you're on dangerous grounds if you have government officials making distinctions as to what is lyrical or what is vulgar. Certainly, you could argue, and I would argue, why doesn't this man just say, oppose the war in Vietnam, it's immoral? Well, I think all of us would acknowledge that that this word has some it'll grab your attention, especially in 1971. This was a word that just simply wasn't used by people. Today, you hear it on a variety of broadcasts, but this was one of the 7 words you couldn't say on television at the time, and so it was really a big deal. The third and the last of the Vietnam War cases, and in the next lecture, I'll get into Texas versus Johnson and flag burning. But in the O'Brien case, we have a man that actually does give a speech. Mr. O'Brien makes a speech from the South Steps of the U.S. District Court in Boston. He denounces the war as being immoral. It's a war that we should get out of. We shouldn't be involved at all. And the speech itself is not what's in question. It is the action that accompanies the speech that is potentially problematic. In this particular case, Mr. O'Brien, who has been sent a draft card by the U.S. government, holds up the draft card. He lights it. He catches it on fire. According to the court transcript, several people in the crowd then began assaulting Mr. O'Brien, and according to the court records, a rather bloodied O'Brien was dragged into the courthouse for his own protection. Now, unlike the first 2 cases, the Tinker case and the Cohen case, where the speakers won, the U.S. Supreme Court protected their speech. They protected Mary Tinker's armband. They protected Mr. Cohen's jacket. But in this case, the Supreme Court upheld his conviction, saying that this was draft obstruction, that this was the destruction of government property, that this was not Mr. O'Brien's draft card to burn, and that he was involved in the destruction of government property and draft obstruction. So in these 3 Vietnam War cases, the Supreme Court comes down on both sides of this controversy. In the O'Brien case, essentially the argument is this was not your draft card to burn. It's evading the draft. It's potential draft obstruction. It's the destruction of government property. You go to prison for that. In the case of Cohen and Tinker, this was Mr. Cohen's jacket. This was Ms. Tinker's armband. In both of these cases, they sent a coherent message that was anti-war, that could be understood by an average or normal person, and therefore they were protected by the First Amendment. Now, in the next case, Texas versus Johnson, I'll just give you a teaser for the next lecture so that I can get rid of a little bit of the background. In this particular case, at the time in 1989, 48 states had banned flag burning. The only 2 states that had not were Alaska and Wyoming. There was also a federal law on the books banning the physical desecration of the flag. So we have a speaker, Mr. Johnson, who gives a very lengthy speech at City Hall in Dallas, in which he denounces Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, notably in Latin America. And Mr. Johnson, after giving this speech, which was protected by the First Amendment, then was involved in political action that accompanied the speech. And of course, the political action that accompanied the speech was he and his group, the Revolutionary Communist Youth Brigade, chanted, "America, the red, white, and blue, we spit on you." They then spat on the flag, and he was arrested and sentenced to prison. And so the question that the Supreme Court needs to acknowledge in this case is flag burning constitutionally protected by the First Amendment? Is it symbolic speech protected by the First Amendment? Or instead, is the American flag a unique symbol that deserves unique protection by the Supreme Court? And in the next lecture, I will discuss both sides of this controversy, and both sides are incredibly, incredibly well spoken, and I'll get into flag burning in the next lecture. Hope you're having a great day, everyone. wash your hands, and be safe. Take care. Bye-bye.